Just kind of telling you off air, like just excited to have you on here. We've known each other for I don't even know how long. I know. Well, first of all, I had your dad as a professor for undergrad, and so I've known of you through him for a while because I remember even having a conversation with him back when you were. This was probably when you were at ETSU, I assume.
Okay.
He was just kind of telling me some of the things that you were doing. This is before I even knew what necessarily being a strength coach was. And then that kind of led me to, alongside Dr. Bastilli, kind of being my mentor, to firing up the force plates that WVU had in the basement in the lifting lab back when I was in my first year of grad school. And me and Dr. Basili kind of ran into issues with the programming, and I guess it was MATLAB or whatever it was at the time. So that
I
was
remember some of that. It would have been LabVIEW.
LabVIEW. Yeah, that sounds right. So that was one of those things where that was the first time that I actually got in touch with you. And we talked on the phone and kind of sorted some things out and we're able to get the software working. Honestly, that's one of my regrets as a coach is I never did end up publishing that study because we only had like 9 subjects and it wasn't it wasn't like very powerful data, even though it would have been something just so cool to have. But and then ever since then, I've just reached out to you at various points throughout my career and just kind of asking, your advice on some sports science things. Even at one point in time, I know I was talking to you about just kind of your professional opinion on me potentially pursuing like a PhD, and we've just kind of stayed in the loop. And now, obviously, both being in the Morgantown area, we've been able to connect multiple times, and we're both on the West Virginia State board for the NSCA. So it's something that we've been able to put these 2 conferences on the last 2 years, and they've been a lot of fun. And it's kind of again like going back to what I said about the point of this podcast. It's just a way to connect and get some good information out there. Um, all that being said, kind of bring us up to speed on your coaching career. I know at ETSU you spent a lot more time coaching. Now you're more on the research and academic side. But just bring us up to speed on your career, and you can go out. Like I said, I was telling you before, I listened to a couple podcasts, and you've gone through like, even prior to ETSU, kind of what you were thinking. I know you had a year at Fairmont State on the football team
Yeah.
there, so there's kind of that interesting connection as well. But yeah, just bring us up to like what you're doing now and kind of what your path has been to your current role.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. And one thing I would add to some of the timeline and us collaborating, communicating over the years is you've had so many of our students in everything from paid internship to unpaid internship to graduate assistantship. And, it's been long enough of doing that now that we have, Daniel Shaver and others that have been students of ours, been in your weight room for a long time that are out in the field working as full-time strength coaches. Um, but yeah, so I've been at WVU now a decade. It's gone quick. Uh, Before that, I bounced around several places, and you kind of mentioned the coaching and academic, and I kind of bounced around a little bit over a handful of years there, where I would have been let's see, I'd have been at 3 different universities, all in faculty roles, Glenville State, Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, and College of Charleston, South Carolina, Charleston, as well as a strength coach for 160th SOAR. So that's part of the Thor 3 program. And prior to that, I'd have been a student at East Tennessee State for 8 years. So I was there a long time. When I got to ETSU, uh, I really just, well, maybe I should say thought instead of knew. I thought I wanted to be a strength coach. And so maybe a better way to put it is I knew I wanted to do something strength and conditioning. Again, at the time, I thought that was be a strength coach. Um, and so, yeah, I did all 3 degrees there, undergraduate, master's, and PhD. And really, I got lucky in terms of timing in several ways at several different times. Um, my first year at ETSU was Mike Stone and Meg Stone's first year, and to luck and timing and all of that, I actually, to add to the small world theme, uh, the year before, so I would have been at Fairmont State. Mike Stone actually would have interviewed for a job at WVU. He was interviewing for several different jobs across the country. He was at the Olympic Training Center as the head of physiology at the time in Colorado Springs. And so my dad actually would have known Doc going all the way back to LSU, which is where my dad got his PhD. And it was where Doc got his first job, to where, believe it or not, he would have started out there as the head strength coach. And this could be wrong, but I want to say the only salaried strength coach, as well as a professor. So, as we would know, strength and conditioning looked a little bit different. I believe that would have been probably late 70s, about. And so, yeah, my dad would have been the one that would have suggested, hey, this person's giving a presentation in the Health Science Center. You should stop by. And so I got to briefly meet them then. I'd have been dealing with I would actually just had surgery, yeah, on my shoulder at the time. I tore my labrum, and I was thinking about going somewhere else, and that's the somewhere else I ended up. And to fast forward a little bit, really, it would have been during my master's degree when I would have done a training study, which more to the luck of timing and those things, when I was doing my master's, there was no PhD program. And so we got some pretty heavy duty projects. Andrew Lane, he'd be another good example of that. But that really kind of captured my interest in research. And I actually still, even like pretty deep into the PhD, would have been thinking I wanted to be just a full-time strength coach. But I would say that after that thesis and uh, one more to the timing of it, the first, right when I finished the master's, was in the PhD program started. And so I would say that I was sort of in this more exploratory type mindset of I want to learn as much as I can. I had a really good situation with weightlifting and with East Tennessee State baseball. So I was the strength coach for them for 5 years. I worked with weightlifting in various ways. I would say primarily as an athlete at the time, and then as a uh, sports scientist that worked with the coaches. My dissertation was a longer training study. It was 5 months with the weightlifting team. And at that time, they actually had, they were designated Olympic training site. And going into the PhD, that helped us get scholarships for the team, which they still have the scholarship opportunity there. As an undergrad, when I went from Fairmont to ETSU, I actually made the switch to throwing, specifically hammer and weight throw. And so since then, and getting into WVU years, I've been coaching the weightlifting club here that's affiliated with the university. I oversee a high school strength and conditioning program. That's a situation where the Mon County School Board funds graduate assistantships. We place those in the three high schools: Morgantown High School, University High School, Clay Battelle High School. I've been involved with projects here and there with athletics, different teams, different times, and even had a stint, 19 to 23, as a volunteer coach for WVU track and field, for throws. The situation for, if you're either it's probably, to my knowledge, always a woman's only team, but if it's either a men's only or women's only team, you only get 3 full-time coaches. If you have both, you get 5. And so that requires in those programs to really lean heavily into the volunteer coach situation to build out some of those event groups. So anyway, I would say my role now more is very strength and conditioning, sports science, education heavy, in that I'm the director of the NSCA CASKI program that's specifically for our undergraduate. Um, and we have a doctoral program in coaching and teaching studies where some of those students are my high school strength coaches. Some of them are funded through other means and have, for example, like embedded sports science roles with athletics. And some of it depends on as far as what the work looks like, depends on their research interests and what their placements or funding situation is. But yeah, I would say over the years it's become very education. I get to coach with the weightlifting, and that's a nice way to also informal educate, work with, is it whether it's the GAs or some other students that are interested in weightlifting coaching specifically. And then we get to have plenty of interns that work out at the high schools as well as with athletics. We've had, everything from the basketballs to Olympic to football, but I would say Olympic is the primary placement our students go. And that's been very helpful with, like I mentioned, the TASC accreditation. So yeah, that's what I'm doing these days. And I'm kind of in that mode of, I'd say, I would have gone through the tenure promotion a couple years ago, and so sort of really call it program building for that accredited undergraduate has been sort of like the last 2 years or so, a big focus of like getting our teaching weight room built up. Where I'm working on another weight room just down the hall from that to be able to coach teams and groups, and that's actually what I was doing up until about an hour ago. And so, yeah, it's all strength and conditioning related in some way. And I would add to that even the sports science I'd say is could be viewed that way.
Yeah, no, I think it's awesome. And like I said, you're kind of like in that perfect scenario where you've got the coaching experience and the academic side and the sports science side. You're kind of able to be able to blend all those things because, to be honest with you, and you and I have had this conversation. I've had this conversation with the exercise phys professors at WVU, and I've had this conversation with the exercise science professors at Fairmont. Like there is a little bit of a lot of, maybe not, definitely not a little bit. There's a lot of disconnect at most universities between here's what students actually need to have like learned and experienced firsthand to be a strength coach or be a sports scientist versus like what they're actually getting taught. And I realize that's because only a small percentage of kids that take exercise science or athletic coaching as their majors, only a certain percentage of them want to actually be strength coaches. But for those that do, in my opinion, most situations they're coming out of the gate unprepared. And whether that's because they just haven't had somebody kind of point them in the right direction of, hey, you need to go start getting an internship. You need to go down to Fairmont and intern with Adam, whether it's paid or unpaid. Like you said, I'm very thankful for that relationship that we have because it's been huge for me because I am essentially understaffed. And it's also been huge for those students that have come down and helped me because it's giving them either unpaid or paid experience or giving them the opportunity to go get their education paid for from a graduate assistant standpoint. So it's been huge from that standpoint. And like I said, you're kind of big catalyst in that, and what you're growing at WVU is going to be great as well. And then just to kind of just circle back to Dr. Stone, like obviously I saw, I guess it was, I don't know if him and his wife Meg presented at that conference at WVU a couple years back, or I think they both did. I think they did like a joint
He
presentation.
he presented and was on a round table. She would have just on the round
Yeah.
table.
Okay, so that was the first time that I'd gotten to meet them
Hmm.
and hear from them in person. But obviously, they're huge in our field, especially from like the periodization, the sports science, testing background. But to me, it's just like it's strength and conditioning history. Like I'm kind of like a nerd when it comes to strength and conditioning history and just knowing kind of who those people were that came before us. Whether it's strength coaches that are like somebody like a Jimmy Radcliffe that's been at Oregon
Hmm.
forever, like the things that he's brought to the table. You mentioned LSU, so whether it's like a Tommy Moffitt, somebody that's been in the trenches of the D1 world, or Mike Joseph, like somebody like that, or whether it's somebody that's maybe been doing some things behind the scenes that you don't always know of, or maybe it's Medvedev or one of the Russian, or again, I'm Louis Simmons kind of like fan of what he kind of at least brought to the table, whether it's everybody agrees with all of it or not. I think that's good. That's what's good about it. Like in my opinion, we want people to bring stuff to the table that you don't always agree with because that's how we all get better. And then the Mon County school thing is like, I don't know if those kids realize how fortunate they are versus all the other kids in the entire state of West Virginia. Like,
Yeah, I
the,
think that's probably the what you just said at the end, the biggest thing. This state of West Virginia, I've I would have been at a wedding. I'm sure you know Amanda Barrett,
yep,
and well,
yep,
obviously Duncan would
yeah,
Duncan
yeah,
would have
yeah,
worked in
yep,
your weight room,
yep,
and I would have been. I mentioned that because I would have been at a table that it was all strength coaches, and three of them were high school strength coaches, and all in the state of South Carolina. And so, to hear uh, uh, about their weight rooms and their coaching situations and multiple experienced and certified coaches in these
right.
places. Yeah, and so it's a creative, I think cost efficient way to do it. And I think that there's some things that are needed. I don't think it's as simple as just every place should partner with an academic unit and it'll go great. I think there's some management things and some kind of structural things that are needed. But it's been exciting to see a couple other places. University of Louisville, Sacred Heart, and a colleague of mine, Chris Tabor's there, and they've been able to put together similar programs.
Yeah, no, I think it's awesome. And it's, again, I don't, I don't know if those kids realize, like, again, we get kids from all over the state of West Virginia. It's, a lot of our student athletes are in-state kids, and there's so many of them that even when they go home now as college kids, like they don't have a high
Hmm.
school weight room that's at least, functional enough for them to be able to
Hmm.
do stuff. Some of these kids are driving 45 minutes to go train at a Planet Fitness over the summer. So I don't think these Mon County kids realize how just fortunate they are to not only have a weight room at their school, but have somebody that's, wants to come in there and help them get better. So I think that's something that's worth kind of doubling down on saying. But um, obviously, we're going to start off with like getting into some periodization. Just I think the first thing to start is, again, kind of going back to that, me kind of just being like a S&C hit kind of history nerd with things, is and I know you had the paper, I had the title here, the addressing the confusion with periodization research. And I believe there was also, I don't know if this was actually like a research paper that you put out, or if it was maybe somebody else that I read, that was essentially a paper talking about the history of periodization. And I know that we all kind of in undergrad learn, the Hahn-Selye general adaptation syndrome, and then kind of how it's went from there. And, you got your Tudor Bumpa and all that
Hmm.
kind of just cascade of coaches, and, all the Eastern Bloc stuff that's been translated, and all of that. Like, I think we all kind of know a basic, we know that that knowledge has been out there since the 1930s, 40s, 50s. It's kind of all started. And even if you go back into like the Greeks and how they trained for their Olympics and all that stuff, but more so from a taking research, taking practical, like, experience, like, how would you essentially define, I guess would be the easiest word, the necessity for periodization? Because again, I think it's crazy. In that one article I was telling you, like, there seems like there's, I guess, an argument against periodization, and whether you're, and we're going to talk about, block and undulating and concurrent and all that here in a minute, but the fact that people aren't thinking about periodization as just a tool anyways, like that's how they kind of base their training program, is insane. um but then I'll follow that up and say, like, to be honest with you, Guy, like, that's kind of what I feel like 90% of sport coaches aren't doing. Like, they don't understand periodization. So that's a very long-winded kind of forward on that, but give us a little bit of background on periodization, kind of, and just basically where you stand in terms of just its necessity, regardless of what periodization model you're following, just the necessity to have some sort of periodization in your training program.
Yeah, so there's a lot of branches to that. I think a couple of things to start. One is uh, you referenced that addressing the confusion paper. I think when you get into these, uh, I'll call them silly debates, uh, there's sort of two different, very, very general types I see. One is more in research land, in academic land, where there's disagreements on, what can be considered evidence, or, we're going to do a review and the inclusion exclusion criteria. Okay, does, for example, some might say if the volume isn't equated between comparison groups, then you can't compare it. Or, maybe if there isn't a control group, and there's a long list of, and we talk about it in the paper, of challenges with this type of research, and we can, if you wanted, we could talk about some of those challenges. But so I think that there's that one type, and then there's the actual strength coaches and the people coaching that have various opinions on things, and so I think they can look to some degree different. At the same time, with the way social media works, sometimes there's like overlap and some confusion that is brought about by that kind of interwoven, we not to, I wouldn't want to turn it into just complaining about social media, but this person, this is my stance, this person posted something and that I agree with that, so that strikes me as, and it might not even really be kind of the underlying, but I think that word underlying is really, really important, because one of the things I've learned, and I guess like a lot of things, I wish I'd have learned it sooner, is so often when people disagree, what they're actually talking about, and maybe even, let's say, arguing about, is really the surface level product of things, and there's underlying things that so often are really where the disagreement lies, or even is just very, very generally heavily influenced. So, let's say if it's two strength coaches, completely different experiences as far as age and stage and sport, right? For research, some tend to do things that are more, I don't know, personal trainer-ish, bodybuilder-ish, and someone's doing, studies on highly trained strength power athletes. And so, if possible, it's so helpful to get, you know, we talk about, for critical thinking stuff, the lens, both your lens and then the lens of the person you're talking to. And if some of that can get figured out, I think that can be very helpful for healthy discussion. But I think starting with the idea that having a plan is better than not having a plan. And I think something that students struggle with is having a plan is not the exact same thing as putting together a periodization plan, right? In fact, I would have asked first day of class, our periodization and programming class that would have already had, most of them would have had our two strength conditioning classes that come before that, foundations, and then our hands-on technique-based coaching class. And I said, what is periodization and what is programming? And generally the answer, the response, I should say, was periodization is macro and programming is micro. And then we discussed that a little bit. And it's, to some degree, yes, that's right. But it's not just periodization is big and programming is small. Periodization requires underlying theory, right? It's a model. So if you just, you could sit down and write a 10-week training plan, and it not be periodized. There not being an underlying theoretical model to support it. And I think that, like so many things, you mentioned general adaptation syndrome. It's one theory that underpins how we might think about, facilitating adaptation and a process to do that. It helps guide the thinking through it, the putting it together, the evaluating, critically thinking about it. Like a lot of well done plans, it's not you sit down for 5 minutes, right? You go over it and over and over it, and everything from training principles to various training theories. It is very, very difficult to research, and to steal from something I've heard Inigo Mujica say, which is the idea that it's sport performance is white box, right? It's not black box where if we put this specific input, we will then get this specific output. But having said that, it's not like everything is completely random and chaotic, and there's a lot of reasons that explain things. At the same time, if it was as simple as you test people in a lab and then you could predict exactly how the outcome is going to shake out, well, that wouldn't make research any fun, and that wouldn't make, more importantly, sport any fun. And I think that sometimes from a research standpoint, treating it like it's black box is at the root of some of the disagreements that we see pop up.
Yeah, I mean that definitely all makes sense, and I agree with you. It's especially on the strength coach side, because there is very much and I definitely have fallen into this and probably still do in terms of just seeing what other people are doing. And I think a lot of it comes back to just like that competitive kind of that ego side of like, well, we're gonna, we beat them on the field, so we must be doing better in the weight room. And it's like, like you said, like just because you're doing something better in the weight room doesn't necessarily mean that your team's gonna win, and vice versa. And it's something that just because you see that strength coach doing this type of periodization model or this type of using this type of training modalities or these types of exercises doesn't necessarily, I mean, you see it. You see success with people that are, and I do have Olympic weightlifting. We're going to talk about that later. Hopefully I will have time. I'll save some time for it. But people that are completely Olympic weightlifting driven and people that are completely powerlifting driven, and then people that are completely, using a water bag, right? And it's one of those things where like, okay, all three of those training modalities can still get somebody to the next level. So you have to realize that like even as biased as we all are, like there's multiple ways to get to the same destination. Now you
To
could
to
argue,
to to the example of uh, challenge in research and something you're talking about there with people wanting to call it unscientifically compare.
right?
uh, you know we can take what the duration that most of these training studies are, and you know okay, we dissect it, we look at responses, adaptations, fatigue, change in performance, all of those types of things. We might critique the efficiency of the training, how much work did it require, that type of stuff. But um it's a journey, right? As far as athlete development, and particularly if we're talking about athletes that really ascend to highly competitive levels. And the call it the perfect training plan for a couple months is going to lose every single time to not maybe as perfect training for years and years and years and years. And that obviously, you have the aspects of genetics and the very sport specific things that go into it. Um, and I think that so often, you know, how often do you really know what the athletes did? How often do you really know what they did, not just in the weight room, but outside of the weight room, which you kind of alluded to a second ago there. Um, and so, I think that uh, maybe it's part of just the culture of S&C for whatever reason, but we seem to everybody self-identifies if you're passionate about what you do. But I think, we're probably not the only profession that has the social media issue of, it really drives some things nowadays to where um, I'm stealing from Dr. Lane, but he likes to say if you see an athlete doing something on social media and you get really bothered by it, thinking that's wrong, that coach shouldn't have the athlete do that, unless it's clearly like uh, negligence, not safe, that type of thing. You probably should do some more reflecting on yourself than someone you have no idea who they are, what their situation and context is, much less the athletes. And so, um, I like to say, I don't know how many professions are this way, but I'm going to guess it's not all that many where when well, you first meet someone and you ask them their philosophy. um, I've seen it many, many times where uh, the initial response is talking about things they don't do. And I find that so interesting. Not that, I mean, everybody has things that they don't do as part of their job, but why would you start there versus the thing you do?
Yeah. Yeah,
And
that's actually, I never thought about that, but yeah, you're definitely right. I've definitely heard that as well. Like where people are almost like identifying themselves by the things that they don't
yeah,
believe in versus the things that they are believing. Yeah, that's interesting.
it's like,
That's
oh,
a very interesting point.
you're a painter. What do you paint? What, how explain your process? Well, I don't do watercolor and I don't do oil. Well, that'd be a weird
Yeah.
place to go, right?
Yeah.
And it's got to be, to some degree, it's got to be social media. At the same time, um, social media wasn't what it is now when I was for sure undergrad, but even I'd say most of grad school. Um, and there was the same types of things, whether it was goheavy.com or if it was message boards and football scoop or the strength scoop, football scoop, or I probably should, musclehead discussion boards I'd have been on back in the day. Like it's the same type of stuff. It's probably, more prominent, and I would say younger developing coaches are probably seeing that type of thing, like you would, if you're going to be on a go heavy message board, you've gotten to a place of interest, right? To where they're probably seeing things as like freshmen in college without any really any experience at all.
Yeah. No, I agree. I wanted to come back to the research challenge thing. So for example, like, and I'm actually, I might have two examples here and kind of get your thoughts on it. So when you're talking about like all the things that you have to control for something to be considered like publishable research, um, if you were to do a, if you were to do a training study, and this is just an example. If you were doing a training study where you were going to look at, um, let's say, one group was going to do velocity based training, one group was going to do just regular percentage based training. And I know that there's been some of these kind of studies done. It would be hard to get that published if those volumes weren't the exact same. If those, like, let's say you had something where the velocity based guys, when they had, or that group, when they got to whatever, a 90% decrease in velocity, they stopped their set, which let's say they were supposed to do 5 reps, but most of the time they ended up only doing 3, right? Whereas the group that was doing regular bar weight, they would still squeeze out those last 2 reps, right? Because the velocity didn't matter. Is that something that you would say, like, you wouldn't even be able to look at that study because you're not controlling for, like, how many factors can you have be in there? And I guess maybe I'll ask my second question, and that might help tie it all together. So
Yeah.
I'm actually just right now, because of what Darren was looking at, and getting the IRB down here with some of the data that we've collected at Fairmont over the years. I'm in the process right now of filling out an IRB so that we can look at any and all data points that we've collected from our athletes, over the years, any of the performance testing that we've done. But every one of our sports teams at Fairmont every year does something slightly different with their training. So if I wanted to look at like our offensive line this year versus last year, like there's too many confounding variables. I understand that. However, if I wanted to split our offensive line and say, those of you that, let's say, need to improve your max strength versus those of you that need to improve your rate of force development, I'm going to split you into 2 groups and we're going to train separately. Would that be publishable, or is there also still too much variance there? I get what I'm getting at here is that you mentioned the challenges. I guess I don't have the research cap on enough to know like what challenges are considered okay, what challenges, like what variances are considered too much. Like where does that line kind of, like, gray
Well,
area?
so that's at the heart of what researchers disagree about.
Okay.
Um, to the example, the study example you gave, I would say that, you know, based on other strong method aspects, that's a good study. And I, for very, very specific things, maybe something centered around hypertrophy, maybe you could make a case where I could say, okay, yeah, it would be good to equate volume. But I would say that the trouble with equating volume between programs is and approaches is that you almost for sure change one of them, if not both of them, in an effort to do that away from something that actually gets done in the real world. And, so I guess more to that, I would make the case that studies where there's, really, really good ecological validity, like these are actual athletes, these are actual competitive athletes, they're actually trained some, and they're, you know, were being detailed with what they did, that even if you don't have a comparison group, that you can learn a lot from that. And I would say that we still need to do a whole lot more of that work, but at this, the spirit of that comes with the idea that we're not trying to solve all the world's problems in one study, right? We can better learn and understand how athletes, okay, they did this one study. There is no comparison group. There's no control group, which even, I mean, the idea of a control group, right? What are you going to, are they not training or, they're probably not doing that. So what then are they doing? When we do this with, you name it, type of block, etc. This happens to fatigue, this happens to adaptation, this happens to performance. And then you do another study, and then you do another one, and another one, and another one. And you can start to get closer to the truth as far as better understanding the training process. There are some incredibly impressive comparison type studies. There's not that many because it's really, really hard to do. Doc Stone did one. Glenn Harris is the lead author. He would have been a GA strength coach at Appalachian State at the time, where they took the football team. They all did a block of strength endurance, and then they did they broke them into three groups. One either did essentially they called it high force, heavy resistance training. The other did like ballistic power based stuff, and so it was like 30% and less. And then another group did it was about 8 weeks. Don't quote me on the exact duration, but the other group did, they called it the combination group. It was a high force and then the ballistic stuff. And so, you find probably the generally speaking, the combination group was superior across the board, but particularly interesting was the it did better than the high force group for producing the best gains in 1RM. And we can think through that with Cellier's stuff, right? They did the high force work. They then had some rest. So you get that rebound. And so, there are some researchers that would say, like, really, really high quality long-term monitoring studies, can't use those for periodization research because you need a comparison. And so, to what I said when we first got going, the disagreements often deal with the underlying things. That's a big one. And so, if you have two people that one thinks all of these things must happen, otherwise it doesn't count. And then you have someone else, like myself, that doesn't think that. certainly there are some things that must be part of the research process for it to be quality enough to, um, but if that's where the disagreement is, that's probably where the discussion needs to be. And I would also say that, yes, we need very formalized processes, and we have research journals and reviewers and all of that. It's incredibly important for the scientific process. But strength and conditioning science research is not that old relative to other, certainly the basic sciences, but even other applied sciences and interdisciplinary branches. It's just a couple decades that we've had uh, the NSCA research journal, and now we have tons of journals. But you look at stuff that was kind of you mentioned like Eastern Bloc research and that, high level coaches and some type of scientific process that's been documented. There's a long, 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 long history to that. And I'm not saying it should be the only thing we look at. But I think it's really, really valuable and important stuff. And I, like you, am a huge, huge fan of history. And I think something as complex and multifaceted as periodization, and trying to put it all together and call it sort of a method to the madness. This is just one example, but I often reference a dissertation that was done out at the University of Texas, Austin. Bourne, Born is the name of the author. It was, I forget, I apologize for not remembering the exact name, but essentially it was a historical document of periodization before 1975, specifically in track and field. And the amount of influence in strength and conditioning that brought about, if you take weightlifting and take track and field, sport coaches that were essentially the strength coach way back, right? And it's got some probably nicer, more straightforward, let's say, stories of science, because it's measured, and that's just, measurement is such a big part of it, including the actual how it's contested. But I'm not saying that type of document should be the be all end all that explains everything for periodization, but it's one piece of the very, very, very large puzzle.
Yeah. Not honestly, you bring up like track and field, and that's something that I've always, and this will kind of tie into some of the periodization models and stuff that I wanted to get into too. Like, I feel like a sport like track and field, especially like the sprints and the throws, and the jumps, all the shorter, more like power, if you will, events. I feel like they're a little bit easier, and especially like weightlifting, right? It's much more easier to control the training variables, especially historically, like you said, the strength coach was the sport coach and vice versa. Whereas now, you'll have a strength coach, but they're also doing their sport. Like, again, if you want to get faster, you can do all the stuff in the weight room, but if you're not sprinting as your sport, like, it doesn't really matter. Like, you still have to sprint, right? You still have to throw. Like, you have to throw the shot if you want to get better at throwing the shot. It doesn't matter what your jerk is, right? Those things impact that, but at the end of the day, the sport is still the sport. So, and the thing about those sports are, and you could even probably throw like swimming in there, is their sports are very measured. Like, that, hey, if we did this 8 weeks of training, and this is kind of the only things that change across those 8 weeks, here's what our 100-meter dash was, here's what our 100-meter butterfly was, here's what our shot put PR was, here's what it is now after 8 weeks of training. I feel like those sports are very, not cut and dry, but they're closer to being very cut and dry in terms of, here's what you did in training. Did it actually influence your performance on meet day, right? And you have less competitions, less meets. So I think, like, when I think of like traditional thought process of periodization, I think for those sports, it's much simpler. And I don't want to like diminish that. I don't work directly with, I mean, I oversee what we do at Fairmont, but I don't work directly with those people at a high level. Versus like a sport like basketball. where basketball practice is going to be like track practice is going to be very similar day to day, week to week, right? You're going to do certain things, right? Basketball practice can be completely chaotic every single day. It can be completely different every single day. You're going to still have certain phases that are going to be similar, but practice is going to be different every day. Your opponent's going to be different every week, right? You're going to have 2 to 3 games every single week that you're going to prepare for a opponent differently. Um, who's in your lineup is going to be different. Like there's so many things that are different. That's where that periodization model, I feel like, gets a little not murky. Like again, I'm still believe in it wholeheartedly, but I feel like it gets a little murky in terms of what us as strength coaches, what influence we actually have on the outcome of said sport, competition, season, etc. I don't know. I don't know if that makes sense. I mean, do you agree or disagree with at least what my logic is there? I don't know if I explained
So
it as well.
I, I very much understand what you're saying there. I think a couple of things come to mind. One is we talk about this. Doc, myself, and others published a paper. It's like block periodization. I think we had the words thought provoking in the title. Uh, but we refer to sports as single factor or multi-factor. And some of those, you could have a measured sport that's multi-factor. Like I would say, rowing would be a good example. Um, uh, and you have aspects of like, uh, there's different terms for them, but like the tactical invasion games based sports, the completely open skill in that. So I think for sure, just very practically as a strength coach, when you have a sport where athletes have to do a whole lot more other stuff, um, there's both the challenge of there's more training stress coming from elsewhere. There's also the dynamic interpersonal between the strength coach and the coach and that whole working arrangement. I mentioned working with baseball at ETSU for 5 years. Baseball was a whole lot easier in the weight room, right, than men's or women's soccer. Just because those sports, with the fatigue from practice and even you can get into just the practical side of like spring sports. I always thought were easier to navigate. You have a whole fall, they come back and they don't even start their season for, I mean, they got practice like call it about February, and then it's March they start, and then you even get to keep them training some, even though it's in season, in now or late May about. Where fall sports, they're gone for the summer and then they come back right when it's practice time. So yeah, I very much appreciate as a weightlifting coach, the plan is the everything plan. I do think if you're talking about really, really high level of those sports, it's advanced stuff and it's not easy. And you're talking about, these are very adaptation heavy sports. So um, you know, I'm not suggesting that, okay, you're strong enough at this thing, and if you're this sport, just stop training. No, don't do that. But, if you want to be a 65 plus foot shot putter, you got to be just insanely strong. And you can give those examples, whether it's sprints or whatever, for their very specific needed qualities. And then also, I think, when you're talking about the higher levels, like the needing to produce that high level performance over and over again. And I've heard this analogy from Hugh Lamont many times when I was a student of his. He would say the elite of the elite athletes are like that drag strip car that the about blows up at the end of the runway, and the parachute pops out the back, and a beginner intermediate level athlete is a Prius. It's real efficient, but yeah. Um, and so I think like a lot of it is really just circumstantial, contextual, and really, my opinion is that all of so many of the basic principles and theories apply, but that doesn't mean you do the same thing, right? And you factor in sport development situation, and then something that we struggle with at the high schools, and I know it is also a struggle in the collegiate setting, disruptions, right? Like it's training consistently is a very, 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 very powerful thing. And we can get into all sorts of debates and discussions about doing this thing or that thing. Sometimes attendance and effort trump all of those things.
Right,
And
right, right.
so yeah, I think that getting to a place of consistency and getting to you know some level of detail, those can be just very, very real challenges, and some of the things if you can, they're the biggest rocks.
Yeah. Well, I think I heard you say this again on another podcast that I was listening to. I'm always trying to like kind of do my homework before I do these interviews, and I think you mentioned about like you could have the perfect plan in place, you could have the perfect exercises, all this periodization, all this program design could all be perfect. You could be testing all these metrics with force plates and GPS and all this, but if you're not monitoring attendance, then it doesn't really matter, right? Like attendance is probably the number one factor in terms of whether your training program is going to be successful or not. And it's definitely something that as a strength coach, like I don't think anybody could disagree with that. Like that's the number one. Adherence to your program, consistency to your program is the
Well,
most important factor.
to think about it in a way of like research design, you know, what is something that is very nice if you can do it is if you are going to compare, break them up into groups and have them different groups do different types of training, um, like a couple of weeks of where they're all doing the same thing, right? Because we know that can influence how they respond, and um, uh, uh, so often we deal with so much disruption and breaks and all that type of thing that how to what degree does that impact things? And that can lead you to in some ways trying to come up with ways to, when I say address it, not simply like, I mean, part of it would be we need to be consistent and work hard and all that, but how do you identify someone that's not responding, and then how what may the reason be, and how do you then communicate that to the coach and all those things.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I looked it up. Is the paper you're talking about periodization and block periodization in sports, emphasis on strength and power training, a provocative and challenging narrative with
Yeah.
Dr. Stone
Hmm.
and Dr. Hoff
Hmm.
and Dr. Fry. I'll
Hmm.
make sure I add that in the
One,
notes here
one,
now.
one other thing, Adam, I'd add to that is the a way I like to just describe the connection between like changes in adaptation, fatigue response, all that, between measured sport and team sport is, if you can, and especially to get coaches to think this way, if you can think through the lens of preparedness, that is a very, very helpful way to do it. I mean, certainly even in measured sports, right? There's environment, there's mental stress. Some athletes always surprise you for the good. Some, there's all those factors. But the situation in team sports where who you're playing against, the tactics of it. So many of those sports, as far as wins and losses, come down to some tactical decisions and all of that stuff. And uh, to where, I think that we can picture emotional, it's sport coaches' job, and wins and losses matter, and all of those things. Um, and so to some degree, thinking through a preparedness of like, were they when we needed them to be, was preparedness elevated, was it not, and yeah, having those very difficult, sometimes, let's face it, upsetting scenarios of our season just ended, or we had a poor season, or we didn't do exactly what we wanted to do. Um, you know, to be as critical thinker as we can, which oftentimes comes to in some ways more difficult things to think about, whether it's number of scholarships or recruiting resources or any of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've had multiple of those tough conversations. And then again, I think it's going back to the critical thinking and kind of putting your, I always want to truly believe, hey, we do everything we can to put our athletes in position to be physically and to an extent as mentally prepared as possible. And then they go out there and get blown out, right? And it's one of those things where that doesn't mean that the basketball or football coaches or baseball coaches also didn't do everything that they thought they were
Mm-hmm.
doing. Like it's just sometimes kids just don't perform, and sometimes they go out there, like you said, they shock you, and like they're like, all right, I don't really know how we feel. We had a bad week of training. Kids just weren't mentally locked in, and then they go out and blow somebody else out. So there's so many factors, especially in the chaoticness of team sports, but even like you said, even in those metric based sports as well. So I do want to just kind of touch on just some of the periodization. And this is definitely not an exhaustive list. And you may even want to correct me or elaborate on these, but kind of the way that I think about it typically is you kind of have your block, kind of like your sequential model, right? Um, you have your undulating models, right? And those are probably still following some sort of sequencing. Um, and then concurrent models. And before you kind of go into that. Now, what I was going to do is I was going to have you say, here's kind of the pros and cons, the block, here's maybe pros and cons, undulating, here's maybe pros and cons, concurrent. One thing that I'll say is like, I personally think that there's, as you mentioned a couple minutes ago, is there's probably a little bit of situation specific for all of them because of the fact that at Fairmont, like our longest stretch with our like football team is actually during the season. Like that's when I actually see them for the longest stretch,
Mm.
right? So it's one of those where I'm not going to use the exact same periodization model in the fall as what I'm capable of using in the spring. And then unfortunately of what I kind of would want to be able to do in the summer because they're just, right. This morning we had 10 guys there. Right. So it's one of those where if I had 75, 60 returners with me in the summer, I would be using a different model than what I'm
Mm.
currently using kind of programming remotely for our kids. So that's where eventually I want this conversation to go is talking maybe about situation specific stuff and how maybe we would adapt each kind of model to certain scenarios and training age and times of the year. But you want to kind of just give a quick maybe hitting not necessarily a historical background, but a quick like background on kind of what those models represent and maybe where you feel like there's some pros and cons to them. Because I think we would all have to agree that there's pros and cons to every periodization model, right? Um, so kind of let you take
Yeah,
off
I,
from
I
there.
would, well, to start, I would say that uh, one of the additional challenges with call it not just periodization research, but periodization education is uh, we have it's a very, very complicated terminology situation. And I mean, and I think the best way to put it is we have concepts that are really not that difficult. Now, there could be underlying physiology and biomechanics and things that are higher level stuff, but um, I'll never forget. It was the first, yeah, it was the first NSCA national talk I ever gave, and I wanted to really get into some historical things. And I had mapped out all this stuff, and I'd reached out to, I mean, I talked to Tabor Quarterbaji, that would have been in Istvan Balier's same lab as Valier. A couple decades later, I would have corresponded with Natalia Vergashansky, Yuri's daughter. Um, and I purposely was avoiding uh, some very direct questions to Doc Stone until I had some things put together, and I'd gone through all the different, uh, Russian lit and other Eastern Bloc stuff, and um, one of the things that really struck me was I, I I forget exactly what the question was, but it was something like this thing, this thing, this thing, and this thing to me are all about the same. They just came from different people. And he said, yeah, back in the 80s, we were doing all this stuff at Auburn. And, um, you know, back then everything was so much slower. Uh, like going from planning a study to publication. And then also things weren't, we didn't have the internet and you couldn't just immediately see something. Now we the second a study comes out, you can, depending on how you set up things, and Twitter, ResearchGate, LinkedIn. Um, and uh, so he said, they've been doing this stuff for years. I would say generally like better understanding periodization and probably specifically block periodization, some things, regarding strength power adaptation. And he was just starting to see some things come out of Russia and elsewhere. And, you in some ways you come up with evidence that leads to, there's the levels to where you get to theory, but make names for it. And so I have some slides in like my intro to periodization, right? It's like uh block, phase, mesocycle, sometimes we're referred to fitness phases. um there's that sort of mesocycle or intermediate level. There's block periodization, there's conjugate successive, emphasis de-emphasis. um I'm thinking of Verdoshansky's last book, Block Training System, that came out right after, a little bit after he passed away. And so, when you have terminology that is similar, the same, coming from different places in the world, literally, it can make things very, very confusing. And I think maybe a place to go to next would be, so, and I appreciate you sending me a little bit of a script ahead of time, because I thought of this too, that very, you have block, you have concurrent, you have undulating. So almost all training plans have those three things to some degree, right? It's more of a magnitude of, like, block periodization isn't just you train one quality. But at the same time, it's helpful to have okay, this is like a more evenish split. Certainly we should have some undulation in volume and intensity, and whether that's within the week, whether it's within a mesocycle or block, to where there's both fatigue management as well as like a progression within the block, whether that's going heavier and heavier and heavier for several weeks and then unload, for strength type adaptation, whether that's like a planned overreach followed by backing off week for several weeks. And so even that, and I think that's a more straightforward, like, there really is no way around that kind of issue that we have, right? And so I guess maybe a good example would be, we, in our high school S&C programs, the school program, I would say we use block periodization, but it's more concurrent than, for sure, our weightlifters, but more highly trained, and should, there's not guidelines, nor I don't think there should be. And that's actually something I think I should say better, maybe more, come to a place of, like, there's actually been some papers that have tried to address, for example, the terminology situation. And I really enjoyed this paper by Deweese from several years ago. That really, like, that was a direct focus of that paper. But do we say, okay, well, does it have to be completely even splits very generally for concurrent? Is 40, if something's 40% and everything else is in the 20s, that is an emphasis. is that enough of an emphasis to be block? And then the one other thing I'd say is I do think there's periodization training models, and then there can be training that is not periodization. And if it's, for example, I would say completely programming led, like there really isn't this bigger picture theoretical model that it's adhering to. And this isn't me saying undulating don't do it, but you know, the kind of go-to cookie cutter model that I don't even actually, maybe this is an out of touch thing I'm saying because maybe it's gotten less popular, but like we're going to essentially do like high reps early in the week, moderate reps middle of the week, low reps end of the week, and we simply just cycle that over and over and over again. Having undulating within the week, and to some degree, I mean, this isn't, you know, the focus probably from one day to the next should change in some way. But you know, there's aspect, right? Is it push pull, or is it you know, okay, it's a lighter pull day, so now it's shifted a little bit more towards power versus strength power, you know, that and so I think that can be a discussion, but exactly how to bring all of those things in together, I actually think that there's more as far as the established things. I think there's actually more shared and agreed. And I promise I'll turn it over to you after I say this. I think a good way to give an example of, if you took, let's say you have a group of 50 people that are highly educated in strength and conditioning as well as highly experienced coaches. And then you have 50 that, you know, maybe they flip through the essentials text and that's it, and don't have experience. If you give them all a hypothetical, right? Like, hey, here's the athlete or athletes, here's the situation, individual sport, team sport, here's the, you know, here's where they're at, here's competition schedule. I would bet you're going to get 100 different, in some way, training plans, right? Even people that are unbelievably like-minded, I doubt would do the exact same thing. I expect like the programming level. My guess is at the periodization level, you'll see a whole lot of commonality in the group that knows what they're doing. And they can also trade off, you know, move the papers around and not just understand, but also learn from one another. And the other group, you're not going to find that. And so I think that, you know, there's reasons why we have to boil things down, but I think to that kind of imaginary 100-person quiz, the getting into, you know, it's a men's ice hockey college team, right? And make this go. You're probably going to see a lot of things as far as volume and intensity, and you know, there might be different ways of doing some exercises, but you know, if it's highly trained people, I can look at something and be like, oh, that you know, I might adjust something of what I had put together.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think I definitely agree with you. I think there's more underlying. I mean, at the end of the day, it's kind of what you said earlier. Like everything still has those foundational principles. Like you're still worried about the said principle. You're still worried about progressive overload. Like those things, it doesn't really matter. Like that's where going back to what we were saying about periodization. Like if you're not like the 50 people that are uneducated and untrained, like those 50 people are just going to throw exercises on the board and they're not going to understand how those things, you know, how they interact with the said principle and how they interact with progressive overload, how they interact with variety in training, right? How they interact with consistency in training, recoverability, all those other factors that strength coaches have to take into account, or that we should be taking into account. And even if you look at, like, again, block periodization and a concurrent model, like when I think of the way things that we kind of do things at Fairmont, and I'll kind of turn this into a question where you maybe try to poke holes into my logic here. So when I look at things at Fairmont, like the summer's kind of a wash. Now, again, we have kids that we do have accountability groups. So I assume that the way I kind of guess it is 75% of our kids do 75% of what they're supposed to do over the summer. It's kind of like our best case scenario. Worst case scenario, it's kind of 50 does 50%, right? Because we do have pretty good accountability over the summer. But when these kids come back in the fall, they have 2 weeks of fall camp before we actually start like regular class kind of training schedules. Like I'm starting them as if they didn't do anything over the summer, because I want to just make sure that, we're doing the absolute bare minimum teaching technique, focusing on, our good rep integrity, rep quality, things like that. But then once we actually get into where we're like in our actual training phase of the fall, like I said, it ends up being about 13 weeks of training. We're doing a little bit more of a concurrent model because the sport demands that they're powerful, strong, explosive. They have high rates of force development, as well as hopefully maximizing some ability to generate some strength development throughout the course of the season. And we've been able to show that happens even for our high usage athletes for the most part. Whereas like a traditional, block model would start with, probably a hypertrophy phase, right? A strength endurance phase. I just don't know if that fits with the volumes that our kids are getting, right, during the season. Like their training volumes from practice are so high that I'm trying to do minimal effective dose, right? I don't even want these kids, like, I don't want them doing one extra rep more than what we need to do. Going back to kind of what you said about the training studies, you mentioned that, if you have two training studies, or sorry, you do a study where you have two training plans, and both of those plans get you to the same destination. And again, I think this was on a podcast that you were talking to with Josh, right? Both of those training plans get you to the same destination, but one of them has less volume.
Yep.
That's the one that's actually the more successful training program.
Mm-hmm.
So in my mind, I'm always thinking, especially in the fall, or in season, I'm thinking minimal effective dose, but we still have to try to enhance those qualities that matter most of their sport, right? Hypertrophy for a football player, unless you're a freshman wide receiver or an offensive lineman, you're probably not worried about that anyways when you step on campus. Versus in the spring, we're going to go through still kind of a concurrent model, but it's definitely going to be a little bit more sequenced than what we would have in the fall, where that first 4 to 6 weeks when they come back in the spring, we are going to be hitting sets of 8, 10, even 12 on some of our, our compound exercises, right? But we're still going to be doing a lot of plyos. We're still going to be doing our Olympic lifts for our power development. So we're still kind of having, concurrent training. And I think you use the word emphasis. That's kind of how I would describe what we're doing. We're really more emphasizing certain qualities, whereas we're constantly training all of them. And then we come back from spring break and we're kind of now back in an in-season spring ball mode. So we kind of go back to, hey, speed and power become our predominant factors, maximal strength, where you can maintain maximal strength, whatever, 3 to 4 weeks without touching on it every single week. So it is, at least in my logic, like, is that logically similar to how you would think about it, and kind of the same factors that you would be considering, just the sheer volumes that they're getting from their sport in the fall, that we want to go minimal effective dose, focus on our speed and power work, and touch on maximal strength, versus in the spring, we're going to have a little bit more of a hypertrophy strength endurance block, a little bit more of a strength block. And then we're just focused on speed and power for the remainder of the spring during spring ball. Again, that's essentially how we do it. My fancy term.
I mean, I don't know anybody that, so even the, kind of most, just block periodization is what they do, would do that general preparation stuff, like the strength endurance, in season. And so really, to me, what you're describing is a very, not just challenging situation, it's a very real situation that's very, very common, right? This happens all over the place. And so, a couple things. One is, we know that athletes that are more strength developed, higher training backgrounds and are stronger, they require not just higher absolute relative intensity, or excuse me, higher jump to it. Higher absolute intensities, right? Stronger people lift more weight. But it's higher relative intensities are necessary to both not just promote, subsequent future strength adaptation, but even maintained. And so there's been some, Fry's got a really good study. There's a common reference papers are the two famous ones by Keo Hakkinen, where it was very, very highly trained weightlifters. And, generally speaking, their sort of just average intensity is 80-ish% of 1 RM. And then we know that in, very not well trained to untrained, I mean, if we're talking actually untrained, which we're not, in collegiate S&C settings, hopefully dealing with, people can lift not much more than 50% 1 RM, or maybe even that, and get a little stronger. And you get into the 60s and they can really get some strength boosts. And so, you take that into as a factor. Can I get away with what you were talking about with minimal effective dose? To where, if you take someone that has been lifting consistently for months and months and months, they have, a pretty hefty strength residual, right? And so you can start doing some of the more typical, like call it maintenance work, our ballistic stuff, RFD. And, if I have uh, a freshman and I know they haven't been in the weight room before, might keep it way more basic and, not say don't do any power or ballistic stuff, but we know that in beginners, getting them stronger, and I use that in a general sense, can improve power as well or better than power training. And certainly, an additional factor that is the residual, the decay rate. Strength hangs in there so much longer, so much better. And so, it's I think if you give like very specific context to things, and this is the perfect example, right? Of you put something out there, I did this, and then someone is like, oh, that's not how I do it, and then disagrees with it. Well, is your situation the exact same? Never mind that also you probably shouldn't be bothered, but someone else is doing that you don't even know. But it's a very, very tricky thing. And I think, at the very least, probably honestly, a simple way to put it is you can get away with doing some more serious strength training, them coming in untrained within reason, and them get some big boosts. And, you might think of it through like, okay, once we get to this part of the season, then we'll shift more. Now they have a little bit of training underneath them, some foundational stuff, and then we'll go to maybe what more would look like what you would start at if they were coming in with months and months and months. And so many examples of people doing, and I know, with NIL and portal and all that, it's a more of a crazy world, but like the returners, or what I used to call freshman program, returner program, often would be different for those very reasons. And in fact, one of the things I would do, and I didn't even necessarily like having a hard fast, if it's this, then this, if not, then this, but the basic idea of if you didn't do anything you're supposed to over the summer, which, often if that happened, that would also be someone that maybe didn't work as hard and get as much out of the training opportunities available to them. If they're just the same as they were when they got here. They probably shouldn't be in the returner plan. They probably should be in the freshman plan. And I remember really having to explain, because I would have had an athlete who would have been a returning starter. He started as a freshman, and the coach not liking that situation. Um, and it's like, look, yeah, I guess it would be great if that kind of was a attention getter, and but it's also best for him, right? To go into the more advanced things when he's, and I would have shown some stuff of like, look, this is where everybody else was and where they went to. We would have, I would have had at that time a couple years of like right when they get their data. So look, he is not only is he the same as he was really strength wise, but this also looks just like they were. Actually, it was interesting for some sports to see like the strength levels incoming kids at 17, 18 as freshmen were really, really similar for a bunch of different sports. And so yeah, you take that into account. And I think I actually probably in class, especially in the periodization class, talk about real world challenges, and that's the fall sport where they're away from you in the summer is like a go-to, right? Because that is just a very, very real world thing. And what like a lot of things where it's not perfect, there's then not a perfect here's what you here's what you should do.
Yeah. No, it's honestly, people that have listened to this podcast and have heard me talk about football and soccer and volleyball and to an extent even the cross country kids, the fact that at Division II level we can't really make anything mandatory. Like we can't really hold their like a coach can't like say, hey, you got to hit 75% of your training sessions over the summer. I'm going to take scholarship money away. Like you're not allowed to do that. Um, through the NCAA. I think that's personally like a. I think the NCAA should look at the fact that that's like not the best thing for player health and safety. Like to expect a football player to get in shape from not having to do anything mandatory over the summer. Now, again, the players should want to do stuff, but they're college kids. Like and as I said before, like if they're in the middle of nowhere in West Virginia, like they might not even have the resources to go train. Right. So for us to not be able to like mandate them to come back early and have like what I would love is July 4th. If all of our kids, every single kid on our football team came back July 4th and we had a month to we didn't have to worry about putting football pads on, we could just lift and train and get in shape for football, then I wouldn't be as frustrated about it. But the fact that we just don't know what these kids are doing. So it's definitely not in the best, like putting them in the best position to be healthy. All right, so we got a couple minutes here. We literally got through periodization, which is half of what I wanted to get to. So we're definitely gonna have to do a round two episode to go into more of the sports science stuff.
Adam, a quick question is at the Division II level, is it women's soccer that's there? Are they starting earlier? And it's just, am I right in that it's just the women and not the men?
So we don't have men's soccer at Fairmont, so I can't answer
Oh,
that.
okay.
I can't answer that question. But yes, I feel like the men's teams are also allowed back on campus. The way that it works at the Division II level, football is allowed back. I think it's like 30 days before their first game, or a certain time before the first day of class. Women's sports like soccer and volleyball are like 21 days or something like that. Like they get like 3 weeks, whereas football gets like 4 weeks before their first game. So football will come back the first week of August. Soccer and volleyball, cross country will come back the second week of August, and then we start class the third week, and then they all play like the last week or the first week of September. So it's essentially football gets a month. But again, it's a month, but really it's only 2 weeks of actual camp because then once you start classes, then you're back to 2 days a week in the weight room. So it's just you just don't get enough time with them.
Yeah,
Um,
because it's on your script, and I think it's one of the ones up next. You had the mention of uh, overtraining, overreaching, that
I'm
thing.
Yeah, yep.
Uh,
I was actually gonna ask that like before we run out of time here. That was like the last question I was kind of gonna
so
ask.
I think that's the perfect topic for what we were just talking about in that. Um, I think that for sure, like when I would have been an undergrad, some of the functional, non-functional overreaching were kind of just coming up, and like I remember seeing some stuff where it was essentially like it's overtraining or nothing else. Um, and I think that non-functional overreaching is so prevalent. Not, I mean, sometimes, yes, it is a situation of poor fatigue management. Like we just had a couple practices that went 5 hours in a row, and now they're fatigued and they're not, to the point of, not that there's a magic marker for overtrained, but the general idea of like, if you're really concerned, if you give athletes about 2 weeks to maybe not completely rest, but you really back off big time, they'll at least get back to baseline. The stuff about like the sympathetic, parasympathetic, getting off kilter and being this long-term medical problem if it's actual overtraining, and how, it happens, but it is very, very rare.
Right. Yeah.
Um, but I think non-functional overreaching is such a common problem, high school, college, um, all for the reasons we've just been talking about, and so it's not that an athlete is in this like they're maybe we should be medically concerned, or they're not majorly fatigued, even. Not to say that can't happen, sometimes it does. But it's just we don't continuously enough maximize adaptation, and then maximize some more, and build on the things that we've already been building. And so there's this constant, and sometimes it's just, start training, they get tired, and they adapt some, and they come back to baseline instead of beyond, or maybe it's even they do take off some and then they come back down. Andy Fry has a great paper. I'm blanking on the first author's name. I was a student of his, with when he was at Memphis with football team. Really awesome study. It was across this spring. It was specifically, I want to say, it was the skill position players, and they go about 2 months of improving all of these things, and then they have the spring practice pops up, and then they go back to where they were, and so that's one type of disruption. But then the other, even what we've just been talking about, breaks. Uh, it makes it really, really difficult, and in some ways, yes, it can be a fatigue issue, but I think we can picture what's the root of this issue, um, and I think a lot of times it actually is just not enough consistent training.
Yeah. Well, and I think the probably the thing that goes, I think all of our coaches, all of our athletes, I think most people understand is like these kids just don't eat and they don't sleep. Like, and that's where I go back to this, especially in season, I go back to the idea of minimal effective dose of like, I don't want the reason that a kid doesn't perform on Saturday
Mm-hmm.
to be because he's still so sore or so fatigued from what we did in the weight room that like he's messed up on Saturday, and I know coaches are going to hate this, but like, I had Tony Holler on the podcast and he talks about, with his athletes, he would rather them be like, if he's working with like a football coach and they're talking about their football kind of program, he would rather them to go into game one 80% in shape, but 100% fresh, like 100% like healthy, right? So it's like that kind of makes sense to me because you don't want to go into a game, you know, 60%, like you don't want to go into 100% in shape, but have 8 guys out because you have soft tissue injuries, right? It's one of those where you'd almost rather baby step your way and kind of play your way into shape. And again, I think sport coaches can't wrap their brain around that, but as a strength coach, like that to me makes it's no different than peaking somebody for an Olympic weightlifting competition. Like you don't want to do too much the 2 to 3 weeks leading up to it to where that athlete goes into that competition and they're, you know, 100% in shape, but they're banged up from whether it's an actual training injury or overtraining or, non-functional overreaching, or just under recovery, and that's kind of my thing is like our kids at the college level. I don't necessarily ever think that we are doing too much. I think the sport coaches sometimes are, not always, but sometimes are. I think it's really just the kids just don't recover well enough. I think that's really more the issue. The paper that you were talking about, is it, um, non-functional? overreaching during off-season training for skilled position players in college football, college American
Hmm.
football. Okay, I'll read that as well when we get off here. But yeah, I think it's definitely something that, and this is something that I've definitely gotten way better at now, especially being in the college world, and being in pro baseball throughout the year. Really, probably was the catalyst for this. But especially now being in the college world, is I really realized I've been able to be better about checking my ego of understanding what we are doing in the weight room versus what I would like to do versus and what I think the athletes need to be doing versus what are they actually going to be able to recover from and go back the next day. And again, does that mean that sometimes some of our kids may be a little bit undertrained? Maybe, but I'd rather have 10% of our kids undertrained than 90% of our kids overtrained. You know what I mean? So, and it's especially when we have 100 kids that are all doing at least a very similar training program, we have to look out for, I always think of that bell curve. We have to look out for like, what does that 60% in the middle of that bell curve, what do they need, right? The 10% at the top end and the 10% at the bottom end, we're never either going to do too much enough, or we're always gonna be doing too much for those kids. It's really those kids in the middle, because they're the kids that make the difference in your program anyway. Your football team and your basketball teams and baseball teams and all that. They're the ones that make the difference. Um, all right, before we wrap up, I'll do half of kind of like my rapid fire questions because, like I said, I definitely want to
Okay.
do another episode because I want to get into Olympic lifting for sports performance, and I want to get into um, sports science, and I even want to get into a
Mm.
little bit of like coaching development stuff eventually. But um, what you personally, what do you what's currently like your favorite lift or all time favorite lift? Like, what are you doing right now training wise? That kind of like you wake up every day like looking forward to doing this exercise or training for this goal.
Well, I'd say to the first part of that, for sure, my bias would be back squat is, just favorite exercise to coach to do. As far as right now, um, uh, are you talking about like prescribing as a coach
No, for you, just for you. Like
for
if I was like,
myself?
hey, like guy,
Oh
you got
God. Well,
you got like
I'm in that. I turned 40 this year.
yeah
And so I'm in that stage of life now, and have one of many I think that have had a midlife crisis, and I do quite a bit of endurance work in addition to strength training, and I did a half marathon in October.
yeah. So
Um,
you've like completely like flipped your training
yep,
modalities now. Then yeah, that's
yep.
interesting. I'm 40s on the horizon for me, and I'm hopeful that I don't get to where I feel like I need to start doing more. And I know I need to do more endurance work, but I'm hoping that I can continue to push through some of this as long as possible. Getting trying not to get banged up very often as much as I was there a couple years ago. All right, so with that in mind, especially now you're doing all this endurance work, you definitely got to have some external motivation, some music. What are you listening to? What's like your kind of favorite genre, favorite artist, favorite song?
Ooh, it changes quite a bit. I would say up and going into the half in October, I really got into Sam Fender. I was listening to him quite a bit. And then last couple months, what are the two albums? Josiah and the Bonvilles, and the I actually don't know exactly how it's pronounced. Drop Teens, Droptines.
I haven't
I
heard of
would
any.
say
I haven't
so.
heard of any
I would
of the
say
three people
both.
that you've mentioned.
So Sam Fender is huge in the UK. Um, he has a "Rain Me In" with Olivia Dean is probably his one song that's been a hit over here. The other two are more, I don't know, alternative country, Americana
Okay.
type stuff. But I would say, like, you know, I saw the Red Clay Strays in March.
Yep. Yeah. Check that.
Flatland Cavalry, their new album. I take advantage of. I enjoy like when new albums come out and kind of waiting,
Yeah.
saving it for the run.
I got you. No, I feel like I've seen you on Instagram at one point in time. Did you have like a Charles Wesley Godwin song or something that you had, or
Oh
maybe
yeah, I love
or like
him.
a actually I think it was one of your posts when your son was born, a Sturgill Simpson song.
Yeah, I like, oh,
I feel like I remember
Sturgis is
seeing
good.
that and that like clicked in my mind because like I don't feel like I know very many people that listen to Sturgill Simpson. And
I was one of those that bought the cassette for his last.
yeah, I got the back here behind me. I have a record player, so I have
Oh,
the,
that's a
the
good one. Yeah.
album for Sailor's Guide to the
But
Universe.
honestly, a lot
Um,
of probably one of my favorite things to do is, Spotify will make those mixes
mhm,
for you.
yeah,
And so I sometimes it'll be like a specific artist mix,
right,
or
right, right,
like it'll be, country mix, and it'll be uh just Sam Barber, Flatland Cavalry,
right.
all that
Yeah,
stuff. Yeah.
no, yeah,
And
Spotify
it'll
will
kind of
absolutely make
change.
those.
Cassius Culpepper, I got into a couple months ago.
I got you. Yeah, I've heard of him. Um, all right, last one, I guess. I got a couple more, but I'll save them for the next time. What is your like favorite sport to watch? Like I'm assuming you probably still follow along with like some track and field stuff. You follow along with some Olympic weightlifting, and like worlds and national and things like that. But like in terms of like maybe like a sport that maybe that you necessarily didn't compete in, what's something that you're a big fan of, or
Hmm.
if you are?
Um, so yeah, I would say I really get into baseball if a team I'm following is doing pretty well, which is a sad thing for me because I'm a Pirates fan.
Yeah.
Um, but there's something to the playing basically every day, the so many games and the sort of games within the games. I'd say that's kind of like I other than maybe I'll watch the last hour of the Masters once a year,
Right.
but how people watch golf, that is kind of like it for me. Um, and then I watch plenty football and track and field. I've probably gotten into watching more consistently in the last couple of years because they're showing so many more big meets
Yeah,
on television, which I think has been so great for the sport for people to get
I
familiar
think so too.
with names and faces and
Yeah,
seeing people they're familiar with.
I think so too. And honestly, like I've really grown to appreciate like the women's heptathlon and the men's decathlon of just how like well-rounded and just amazing athletes that those athletes are. Like again, don't get me wrong, 100-meter dash, great. Like that's insane. It's awesome. It's super competitive, but those multi-event sports or multi-event athletes are really cool for me to watch. And like I know the women's nationals was just on this past weekend and stuff. So, well, we're right up to the time. Like I said, we got through about 50%, maybe even a little less, which is I expected that because I know that this is stuff that's very, you know, it's complex. It's not something that's you can answer in a one sentence. It's not something I can even ask in one sentence. And I think it's really cool to hear from you and get your take on some things. And definitely looking forward to doing another episode. And I'll definitely get a hold of you and kind of see when we can set that up and make it work. So, but I appreciate you, and I'll work on getting this posted online.
Okay, appreciate you having me. And yeah, I'll look forward to doing another one of these.
All right, cool. Thanks, guy. Have a good one.